Hi everybody and welcome. I'm Hannah, I'm the Head of Marketing and Production at the Open Data Institute. Welcome, and I hope that wherever you're based, your day isn't looking as dreary as it is here in East London. It's my real pleasure today to welcome Julian Tait, co-founder and CEO of Open Data Manchester. Open Data Manchester is a not-for-profit organisation that helps organisations and communities understand and use data. In 2020, Open Data Manchester set out to discover whether a data cooperative model could be developed that would enable organisations and communities to collect, pool, process and share data for the benefit of their members. I'm soon going to hand over to Julian, who will discuss some of their findings and what's emerged from them. But just a bit of housekeeping before I do. Please keep your videos and microphones off for the duration of the talk. And we'll be recording today's talk as you'll have seen. And if you've got any questions, and please do ask questions, please pop them in the chat while Julian's talking, as and when you feel inspired to. And at the end of the talk, I will prompt you one by one to read out your questions. And if you'd like me to do that on your behalf, please let me know and I'd be happy to read them out for you. Lovely. So over to you then, Julian.
Right, thanks very much, Hannah. Thanks very much, Freya. Or was it Hannah? Sorry. Off to a good start there. Hello, everybody. As has just been described, I'm Julian Tait from Open Data Manchester, and I'm really pleased to be able to share some insight into what we've been doing recently. So, without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully, it will all work. Can everybody see that? Yeah?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Right. So I think briefly, as has just been said, I just want to give you a little bit of background to who we are. We're based in Manchester, obviously, but we do work further afield, and we do work collaboratively with lots of different organisations wherever they are. And I think our kind of mission is to kind of the idea that the data should be used to make the world a fairer place, and should promote equity, and we should be using data ethically. And so we support organisations and communities to do that. And we've been really interested in cooperative principles for some time. I think it was back in 2012 we first started looking at whether co-ops could actually, as a structure, a governance structure, could actually start to manage people's data, because we were starting to see that kind of the exploitative practices, the over extraction of people's data, and we ran quite a few workshops around that, trying to understand whether there could be a certain kind of overlaps. And I think actually what underpins a lot of cooperation as a structure is that there are kind of these kind of principles, 7 common cooperative principles. I also have a dog, and my son's just arrived home and he's going to shout, but bear with me. And we have the 7 cooperative principles, and I think these do kind of overlap on potentially what an equitable data organisation could do. The idea that they're voluntary and they have an open membership. So the idea that they're open to all people who use the services and willing to accept the responsibilities of the cooperative. I mean, they're democratic, and all members should be able to participate in some way. They also should have a certain amount of autonomy and independence. And I think what is really interesting with regards to the cooperative as a structure is that they should have a function where they educate and train and allow people to be fully informed when they participate within the cooperative. And also there's this kind of the idea that cooperatives will try and naturally cooperate with each other, which brings around wider society benefit. In fact, kind of 10% of the world's population is involved in some kind of cooperative or other, whether it's actually actively within or actually use cooperative services. So this is quite interesting. So we find this very interesting. So as was stated, that in 2020 we started working with an energy cooperative, or energy reduction cooperative, I suppose, in a way, in Manchester, trying to see whether the data that they collect and the data that their members hold can actually enable them to create better services and actually help reduce the carbon footprint of the membership and develop new ways to combat climate change. What was really interesting about the cooperative structure is that people who were in that cooperative already were already aligned with a particular purpose. And actually, if you start to look at energy as a kind of use case, with the idea of what kind, and look at what kind of data is being created, you can actually see that with our energy usage, we actually reveal quite a lot about ourselves. And so to have some kind of protective structure that enables members to understand that kind of what data is shared, because behaviors can be inferred from it, we think is really important, and was one of the drivers of the work that we did. And we did this as a kind of co-design process, so we're working with the membership to help them understand, raising capacity, so everybody was on a fairly similar level when we started to work out how we were going to build this data cooperative, what we needed to. So simply, and I think it's really good to look at this as a kind of take it back to basics and then kind of expand out. It's like the cooperative, the data cooperative will already have a membership, and kind of by being in the data cooperative, they're already consenting to some kind of data sharing, within that, and that might be for development of new services, or it might be to share to a third party. And how we see the data cooperative, the member or the actual cooperative itself decides on what conditions they will share the data. So a lot of the things that we're looking at were about kind of what types of entities we would be willing to share data with, the ethos, policies, reputation, impact, purpose, and value. And these are quite hard to define kind of categories, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And once that process has been done, then the member will share data with the cooperative, and the cooperative holds that in a kind of secure way. So when we get to the situation where a data user comes along, which may be an energy company, or it may be some other, it may be somebody actually within the cooperative, if they fulfill the criteria that's been set by that person, then through some kind of matching and verification of what has happened, that data user will receive the data. So that's the kind of the simple concept of a very simple data cooperative. But there is an underlying complexity, as with all these things, because if it was that simple, people would have done it already. There are cooperatives that already exist, so people are doing it already. So we're by no means the first. So the exercise of as part of that kind of co-design working was trying to kind of understand what the kind of data that people hold, and also what are the data flows within the cooperative. So if we start with the idea that the cooperative contains membership, so the cooperative actually is a membership, and so the data cooperative could exist in one form where members of that cooperative donate or they're allowed data to be collected by that cooperative. So in essence, this is a very basic flow. The data just is contained within the structure of the cooperative, and in fact that's kind of how Carbon Cooperative is working, and many cooperatives work at the moment. The data is actually contained within the organization, and is kind of is dead data, really. It's used for the purposes such as a membership database or just kind of an energy usage for a project, but it doesn't really go any further. So the value is not returned to the members or the cooperative itself. Then we get to the idea that we have the data can actually flow within the cooperative. So there may be a member of the cooperative, especially within the example of Carbon Coop, may be developing or trying to create mitigations to, or they're trying to do some kind of work on their place where they live, such as kind of insulation or double glazing, triple glazing, or whatever. But they don't know quite how it works and quite what the performance, what would they be getting if they do that work. And by the data cooperative could enable that sharing of information or sharing of data amongst the membership if certain criteria are met. Then there's this notion that you could kind of then expand it out. So you could have federated flows. So you could see that aligned organizations, aligned cooperatives could start to share data if they had a similar ethos. So an example could be a cooperative that is a micro generation cooperative that may have small scale solar, wind power, or hydro that you sometimes which do already exist. They kind of might match up with a consumer cooperative or a energy user cooperative where people are pooling together so that they can then buy energy at a cheaper rate. By sharing data, that can allow certain kind of load balancing and a closer relationship between those, and they can both benefit from that. There is this idea of third-party flow, so that the cooperative could share almost in the way that data is shared already, where it licenses out the data that's held within the cooperative. Obviously, certain criteria have to be met, but that relationship is more of a kind of a license where the value is defined, such as you pay X for this, or you provide certain services for this, or this goes towards a certain kind of piece of research, and it tends to be very, very defined. And lastly, working with the group, we kind of identified there was this kind of the creation of a data commons or creating open data. So the data cooperative, the Carbon Cooperative itself, is obviously trying to decarbonize our economy, trying to reduce the impacts of climate change. And so by creating a common resource of data that may be useful to others to use, could be seen as being certain value, as long as it aligns with the cooperative aims. So they're the kind of data flows, but people have to kind of work out the whole process of consent is a little bit more challenging. And actually, we all know how onerous the cookie consents that we get when we browse the internet. Most people actually just click because they don't have the time to kind of unclick all the options when a cookie pop-up comes up, and actually that is so basically that system doesn't work. But we kind of looked at whether the idea of, if people were sharing data, would people want to have granular consent? And actually, as I said, that doesn't work. It becomes too onerous. People either don't engage, and also so consent is misapplied. Also, if for every data request or every type of data that the cooperative could potentially handle had to be handled that way, it would fall apart, because you would trying to get consent from each of the members to share. So it looks kind of group-based consent. So it's kind of using archetypes or personas. So a person like this would share this type of data, and people could actually align with that. And if any other requests came in, an assessment was made, and depending on those those permissions that had already been granted to the persona, then that data could then get shared. It would make the process more efficient. And then we kind of looked at kind of a very basic traffic light consent, where it's very permissive, where as long as the cooperative deems it right to share data, then they don't mind that happening. Because people could have it more controlled, which creates a granular kind of consent mechanism, which as we know is very, very onerous, or they just want to share data within the cooperative. So each has a different impacts and different outcomes with regards to how the data cooperative could work. And actually, talking within the groups, there seemed to be quite an appetite to share data if it was aligned to the purposes of the cooperative. And so the whole assessment process is really important with regards to that. So we come to governance. So how is that data sharing assessed, and how is the cooperative actually managed? So we went down this kind of very quite a circuitous and labyrinthine route, actually, because data is obviously data. There's potential that many requests could come in, and different types of data may be requested all the time, and to actually govern that might actually be problematic, especially if people had different types of preferences that were set to allow sharing. So we kind of looked at these kind of more automated kind of data flows if certain criteria were met, as was described in the first slides. If certain conditions were met, then that would allow the data to flow. The setting of the conditions would be defined by the cooperative. So there's the idea, so the membership, the people involved with the cooperative, would define what conditions needed to be met, which would obviously align with the purposes of that cooperative. To make that process more efficient, these kind of rules would then be that would then enable an algorithm to actually share the data. And this was really interesting, because the process that we defined even had logic, and people could understand it. I mean, there was obviously certain concerns with certain bits, because obviously when you're trying to define things that are based on values, there is a lot of discussion. But the main area of concern actually was about if this process was automated. So various safeguards had to be put in place. People want to see, there had to be proved that this would work. So people would want to see the whole system working manually. And if they felt confident with the system working manually, then they could perhaps incrementally move over to a more automated system. But they had to see that this algorithm worked, and it had to be audited. It had to be, they had to see that it was working within tolerances, and people would want to see who it was sharing data in, and under what conditions. Another complexity was how do you assess organisations who want to use your data? The energy market, although it's obviously becoming more simplified as more energy providers collapse, is complex, and there are many organisations who want to use energy data. Health organisations are one of them. There are a number of projects around the country which are looking at that behavioural data that comes from energy usage to see whether people, especially vulnerable people, need some kind of attention or care, fuel poverty, etc. There's many ethical issues around this. I'm not 100% sure I entirely agree with them, but the whole process of actually defining the criteria for sharing is really important, but can be quite onerous. The example that we looked at was, there's a magazine called Ethical Consumer Magazine, which does all these kinds of audits, and it is a very long and painful process, but this could happen, and a system could be set up. And then we look at a kind of the different types of models within a cooperative. So when we were looking at the Carbon Co-op, we were initially looking at what's called a flat structure, a single class of stakeholders. So basically everybody had parity, everybody had an equal vote within the organisation, and they decided who the officers were of the organisation, and those officers were accountable to those members. And that's how democracy and accountability was maintained within that structure. And this is actually, we think, is a really strong element of that, of the cooperative. It's that accountability within that kind of data subject environment. So within the single class of stakeholder, so that within the single stakeholder environment, you would have people who would, as shown earlier, would select kind of the way that would collectively decide on the ways that data was shared, or the mechanism to share data. The cooperative would collect that data, and then depending on if the cooperative decided, it would then, or the systems put in place, the cooperative would share that data outside the cooperative, and that accountability would be maintained. But the world is a little bit messier than that, and we've been looking, or we've been talking, especially in Greater Manchester, and we started to see it in other places as well. The idea of different classes of people, and when I say classes, I think I'm not using the strict sense of there's certain kind of definitions, especially within types of cooperatives and different organisations or structures, about classes. And it's about power and voting rights, etc. But we're looking at civic data cooperatives. Can you enable responsible regeneration through better data sharing? So obviously the property developers have a certain power and certain agenda. Local communities also have needs and want to see things done responsibly in a certain way. The local authority has a certain responsibility. Utilities have a responsibility. And it's about, is it possible in the need that, especially within regeneration, can an organisation be set up that has kind of different classes? So within here, we've got kind of closed environment, the two-class multi-stakeholder environment. So you've got people, so maybe organisations who would traditionally be very powerful, and say communities or individuals. And the democracy would be maintained by allocation of vote share. So perhaps certain parties or certain classes would only have a certain proportion of votes. Therefore, that's how information gets shared. That's how the data gets shared. That's how the running of the cooperative gets shared. What we see also, what we kind of see, and when talking to people who've been involved with cooperative development, is that actually the data cooperative mimics or overlays the real world. It's not replicating any structure as such. It's just overlaying. And then we have a more intriguing type of cooperative structure, which is still a multi-stakeholder cooperative. It's where you have data subjects and data users. So you might have organisations who don't want to donate data, but they have an interest in how the data is supplied, and they could be part of that cooperative as well. So we don't see that. We haven't really seen any multi-stakeholder cooperatives as far as data cooperatives are concerned, but we do see them, especially within healthcare, with providing community services, especially in Italy and Canada. And I know there's more that's further afield, where you have service providers, you have the users of the service, and they're all within the same cooperative, and that is democratically controlled. So it can exist. It exists in the real world, but not necessarily in the data world. And it's the role of the cooperative and the governance structure to enable that to be handled equitably. I think more interestingly, is how these things can scale. I mean, we see that the cooperative movement there are some very large cooperatives. I mean, the Cooperatives UK or the Cooperative Group is a very large cooperative. In fact, some of the largest organisations in the world are cooperatives, especially when you look at some of the agrarian cooperative federations in India. I've forgotten the name of one of them, but it might come to me later. But what we find interesting about the federated model is when you're starting to look at supply chain and visibility of the supply chain. So we've been talking to an organisation based in India who was quite interested in how informal or invisible workers who were generally exploited could be made visible through a cooperative structure. They were very, very vulnerable. They might already be convening as a collective or a cooperative, but they were invisible, and said they were exploited. And whether visibility in the supply chain may create more accountability, especially when we have greater awareness of where goods come from, clothing, electronics, etc. And some of that still involves that informal supply chain, and how can that be represented? So we have the kind of, as I've described, you have kind of data provider cooperatives, multi-stakeholder or single stakeholder, etc. You know, data users, etc. And they supply data to an aggregation cooperative, and that, under various governance rules, will allow that data to be shared. So a data user might be an end, might be a retailer or something at the end of the pipeline that needs to audit the trail needs to audit their supply chain. Or they might have NGOs or government who want to use the data to see how this structure is performing, and whether any kind of change needs to be made within legislation or support, etc. So you have those kind of data flows that go into the cooperatives, but also there is this governance of the cooperative. So you can have a scaled governance, so that each of the cooperatives that is involved is actually also has some kind of democratic stake in the aggregation cooperative. And data users can also have a stake in it as well. They need to see that the data that's being provided is how they want it, but the safeguard is that the data providers actually have the controlling say. I mean, the proportions that are here are just kind of fairly academic, but you can see how that balancing of that power can actually work. And also the cooperative itself, because it has to manage all that data, can actually then have a role in supporting the development of data standards, data governance and accountability within those organizations, so that they can so that they feel as though they're all kind of working together. And so that's generally how these things can we think these things can progress. So tackling this, we've kind of, over the last year or so, especially after the ODI project, we've developed a data cooperative working group to look at some of these issues. This is an open group, and I have my email address at the end. If you're interested in participating in it, please do. It's quite international. So we've got people from India, Korea, US, Europe, etc. And they're all looking at whether cooperatives can solve some of the problems that they face within their own communities. There's a lot of researchers as well. The next one has not been set, because the group's deciding when it will be, what time it will be, and because it's hosted by different partners, so everybody will actually be similarly inconvenienced. It might be at 8 o'clock in the morning, it might be at 7 o'clock at night, or it might be 12 o'clock. But how we're working on this is we're posing questions, and then as groups we're working kind of sprints to examine these, and we come back and then we go on to another, we start tackling another issue. So if that's of interest to you, there's a bit.ly link there which shows the progress log of the working group. It's all open, so we're doing it, so we're hosting it, but we're hosting it with the Aptitude Institute in Bangalore, but anybody else who wants to help host it is more than welcome. It's totally open. And so thank you very much. That's me. There's details, and hope to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Julian. Really interesting talk. If you'd like to submit a question, I can see there's one here already. Please submit them in the chat. And as I said earlier, I'll go through them one by one, and either you can read it out or ask me to. Completely up to you. I've actually got a question to kick off with, Julian, and I was looking at the sort of case study on the ODI website around your work with Carbon Co-op, And I noticed that one of the key sort of lessons learned from it is that it's easy to convey the general function and purpose of data cooperative models, but explaining the details of how it's governed and how those processes are managed is hard and takes time. And I just wondered whether you found since then, whether you found any effective ways of doing this.
I think the way is to, I think the challenge we have, and we spoke about this with regards to supply chain cooperatives, especially when you're talking about people who may be exploited and living in precarity, and they're kind of, understanding data may be the least of their concerns, and so it's kind of, it has to be explained with kind of, well, what does this mean? How does this affect me? Which can be sometimes quite abstract and intangible itself. But I think also with regards to the work that we did, we know, and I think this is part of the whole cooperative model anyway, is that you have to empower people to understand what is going on, how things are being used. And I think that's kind of where the cooperative structure over some of the other structures, data custodian structures, actually kind of wins in a sense, because it's there for its membership, it's controlled by its membership, and therefore to be informed, to make choices that have the valuable choices that and have agency, you do need to raise that kind of understanding amongst your membership.
Thank you. Cheers, Julian. We've got a question here from Fergus. Fergus, would you like to read it out yourself?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Hi, Julian. Fascinating half hour there. Just I'm in and around co-ops a lot, and I just know that the governance is really complex. So it's not a simple thing, and you have to get so many people engaged with the governance itself. So my question is around, what's your experiences of the challenges around maintaining the administration resource, or the volunteer time and everything needed? How do you? I'd just be interested to know your experience so far.
Yes, they are. They can be very burdensome, and I think actually as cooperatives grow, what you do, you get, I mean, there's a thing, it's called I think they do call it the burden of governance, and you find that some people will actively participate in everything, and some people will just want to know that it's just being run properly, and that and if they're not happy, they can represent themselves and challenge. I do think, I mean, democratic processes can seem to be very onerous, but it's dependent on what the membership want, really. And I think that, you could just set up an organization, a light touch organization, where you've just got a group of people who then kind of have, I suppose, a client relationship, and that'll be easier. But we're talking about something more so it is onerous. And also actually the data cooperative, while we're looking at the risks around data cooperatives, it does seem as though one of the more sustainable ways of running one is that it augments or overlays an already existing cooperative, so it kind of maps the already existing business of that cooperative, and therefore borrows some of the governance of that cooperative. All I can say is yes, it can be onerous, and that's.
No, thanks. And I think the ability to try and map it across something else that's existing. I think that works. So no, thank you.
Thanks, Fergus. We also have a question from Lawrence. Lawrence, did you want to read out your own question?
Sure. Thanks, Julian. Yeah, I mean, you covered quite a lot of different options, and clearly there's a lot of different variations from governance to sort of how all the sort of parameters are set up. And I wonder how you were able to sort of evaluate different options and come to a view on like what was the best for Carbon Coop at one time. And I imagine you can look across the landscape and look at what other people are doing, but is there any other ways that we're able to sort of iterate or test some of these structures sort of quickly and then change them, or is it a bit more sort of just take a view and see what happens?
I think the whole the work that we did with the ODI, or that was supported by the ODI, was looking at whether we could actually develop a kind of standard model. So if you're involved, I mean, people who are involved with co-ops will know there generally are certain kind of model rules that you can borrow, and that was kind of what we were hoping to do. But it's a bigger piece of work. I mean, I think we're a little bit naive when we started out, but in a way we were willfully naive because we didn't quite know what we would have to deal with. I think that the way that sorry, Lawrence, you're going to have to ask me the question again. I've totally lost my train of thought. So my son's just walked behind me, and he's just kind of distracting me. So that's my excuse.
The question is just, given that there's lots of different options for how you can structure things, how did you decide which one to pick?
That came through the workshops, actually. So we discussed different ways. So generally, unfortunately, and with the well, it was obvious that this was going to happen. Really, within the cooperative, it was a self-selecting group. So these were people who were very engaged, who kind of understood the mechanics of cooperation anyway. And through the kind of the workshops where we were looking at different kind of models, this is how these started to become defined. So it was a kind of discovery exercise. And I think that what we hadn't quite got to, and we're still working on with this cooperative working group, and is looking at this notion of this overlaying of already existing organizations. And I think that I think that's the most logical way. And speaking to Carbon Coop as we do, it's kind of, I think they're more interested in creating that overlay organization or augmenting their organization in a sense, because I think that to create a cooperative out of nothing would be quite a task, unless there's huge high value data that exists.
Thank you, Lawrence. Other people, feel free to add your questions to the chat, but in the meantime, I've got a question about more broadly, during your explorations, Julian, whether you explored whether data cooperatives, how data cooperatives can demonstrate to the data users that what they're doing is trustworthy and ethical, and are there sort of any frameworks or any means of kind of easily being able to show that this data that's being shared between them is being handled in the right way?
I think this, as mentioned when we talked about how we set up the permissions of sharing or the consent, which is still, as I say, still a little bit fluid at the moment. You kind of create you define what organizations you'd like to work with. One of the ones that came up was within energy, was that how do you what's the difference between working with, say, a green energy company and a company that does green energy? It just augments their normal business. Is there any difference? And does that, would members of the cooperative want to take a view on that with regards to how they would interact with that organization? And the cooperative would work that out itself. I mean, there is no right or wrong way. They have to define that, and being part of that whole defining what and who they will and who they won't work with, that's perfectly fine, and that's part of the whole kind of democratic governance of the organization. And hopefully want people to participate in that. A lot of people probably won't, but as long as enough good people do, who have the interests of the cooperative at heart, then that should work. And also this idea that you kind of create this kind of reports of who you share data with, how you shared it, etc. quite important.
Thank you, Julian. So just before I finish up, if anyone has any final questions, feel free to put your virtual hand up and speak now. Okay, no, doesn't look like we've got any final questions. So thank you. Oh, we've got one just as I was about to move on. Marcel, would you like to ask a question? You're on mute, Marcel.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Julian, for the interesting talk. I have a question about this supply chain example you gave in India. Was it an actual project you conducted? And if so, like, what were your experiences? Like, how could you kind of, yeah, have a result that kind of raised the social aspect in the whole supply chain?
Right. So this is a project we're just in discussion with. We're just in discussion with certain partners with, and I think that the challenge. So basically, what came across was the challenge of this kind of visibility. So there's kind of the demand side need to be more accountable and show that the products that they sell and they get produced are done in an ethical way. And there's the kind of the bottom need in the sense of better working rights, fairer pay, less abusive working practices, etc. And it's about how do you protect the people who are vulnerable at the bottom. So as part of the project isn't started, it's still in discussion, but it's seeing as perhaps that if you just had some kind of validation process where the people at the bottom, who the workers were just kind of all identified, then they could be exploited even further. And there is that kind of move to the more datafication of the workforce anyway. It's kind of these kind of validation of supply chains and stuff like that. And so because within these kind of producer worker kind of environments, there are these kind of cooperatives who are starting to be formed or who have formed. I mean, India's got great heritage of cooperatives. I think it's one of the largest cooperatives in the world is based there. I think it's a milk cooperative, Gujarati milk cooperative. And so there's those kind of that cooperation or that coming together already exists. And so it's kind of enabling those organizations to then also better look after the interests of their members through being able to, I suppose, control the flow of data and protect the workers from that extraction, which might make them more vulnerable. So yes, it's still in discussion.
Thanks very much for that final question, and thanks again to Julian for such an interesting talk and for answering the audience's questions. And thanks to the audience for joining us today. If you'd like to watch again later on today, we'll be uploading this talk onto YouTube, so you'll be able to find it on our channel. Just before you go, I just want to give a quick plug to the ODI Summit. It's focused on data people this year, and it's on the 2nd of November. So visit our website, theodi.org, for your tickets. But what's more, we can offer you a 20% discount. So if you put the code LL-20, that's LL-20, you'll get 20% off. And let me just put that in the chat. Okay, that's done. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julian. And thanks, everyone. Have lovely weekends. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.